Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now in this video I wish to talk to you about memes, but not only memes but also music and language in general, because, well, actually mostly we will be talking about language in general, but anyway, both music and memes are forms of language, so I don't see a problem in that, and hopefully you would have fun anyways. So the motivation behind this video and the essay that this video is based upon was that this quite frequently encountered idea that, you know, I've seen it more than once, let's say, and it might be well summarized with this picture that I once saw. Unfortunately, I cannot find any links to that, but anyway, so in this picture there were like aliens in their spaceship or whatever observing Earth and kind of saying to each other like, what the hell, what are these humans crazy or something? Like, it seems like their evolution have reversed, you know, and they're using pictures to communicate again, you know, like in Paleolithic times or something. I hope you would appreciate the irony here that the very idea was in the form of picture, right? But anyway, there's this idea that right now we're communicating with these pictures, you know, funny pictures on the internet, emojis, etc., and it's somehow it's like the devolution or de-evolution, I don't know how you pronounce it properly, with respect to, you know, this supposedly, again, high culture of written word. And maybe spoken word also. But anyway, so there's this pathos that, you know, oh, the grass was greener previously, now we became stupid and we're just, well, yeah, we're bad people essentially. And it kind of ties neatly to this repentive thinking that I was talking about in my video called Repentive Thinking. But anyway, and you know, also there's this very prominent cultural tendency to say like, oh, young people are stupid, they're so perverted, and, you know, like, and again, it all ties to that idea of the grass was greener, and the funniest thing is that each generation considers its young people as stupid. You know, it's very funny to read some ancient Greeks stating literally the same thing, etc., etc. But anyway, so again, supposedly the communication with the help of pictures is stupid, right? Yeah, well, we might say that, yeah, there exists some concepts, let's say, some complicated narratives that are impossible to depict with a picture or animation or whatever, video. And yes, this is the case. Yeah, I would agree. But at the same time, one could say, well, hey, wait a minute, like, there exists some pictures that, or animations or videos that you cannot describe with words at the same time, right? So you cannot definitely say that, okay, this is de-evolution, like we've simplified stuff. We haven't simplified stuff, it's just that, you know, the form of expression is different, which is not entirely, you know, might be entirely encompassed by the previous form. No, they're like, they have some intersection, but there are areas of both of them which are inaccessible to both of them again. But okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later, I think. So I would claim that the whole narrative that you know, this graphic communication is more stupid than the written communication. It's really rubbish, in my opinion. So, and I would say that this tendency towards more graphical, animated interaction is actually not as bad as one might think it is. That's basically one of the main points of this whole video, and I'll try to show it to you in the next, I don't know how many, half an hour maybe. You have the advantage, you already see how long this video is, but I have no idea at this moment, obviously. So we'll examine a couple of phenomena that are characteristic of languages pretty much any languages, but especially today, especially one of these two phenomena is the most prominent today due to some technological developments. And perhaps, I would say, perhaps there are certain terms for these processes that are already accepted in linguistics or something, or even philosophy, which I'm not aware of because I'm not a philosopher. I'm a philosopher, and I'm definitely not a linguist. I'm a cunning, yeah, okay. So, but I would disregard that, you know. I would completely ignore any sort of professionalism in this consideration. Like, I'm just a free thinker, you know. Yeah, that sounds horrible, to be honest. But anyway, so I will just, you know, grunt like a pig in the dirty puddle of my own ignorance and dilettantism, like, and that's it, pretty much. This is what the next, let's say, half an hour of this video is going to be about. So okay, so we'll talk about the evolution of language, pretty much. And I would say that the most prominent feature of the evolution of language is the tendency to condense, to kind of compress the messages, essentially. So the point is that you have more and more information. I mean, as time goes on, as culture develops, you have more and more information in less and less of the, let's say, written text even, or less and less of whatever the form of representation of the information you're using. So there's a certain kind of archiving of the information in your medium of communication. So like, okay, so once I've had an sort of like an argument with a friend of mine who was, it wasn't really an argument, it's basically he was asking me like, why the hell are those, you know, ancient, or maybe not ancient, but like old authors, like classical literature, etc., like, why are they so like, you know, persistent, so diligent, so lofty, so bulky, you know, in some sense? So like, you might find so prolific, yeah. So you might find situations where old authors, let's say from 19th century even, they use like several paragraphs for a thought that was already clear for you at the first two sentences of these paragraphs, you know. So why do they spend all that time, all that text to convey this really simple thought? That's a good question that he asked me, and I was thinking about it, and I think there are at least two reasons for that. So one of the reasons, which is kind of floating on the surface, is that the character of education previously was very, you know, elitist. So only a minority of people could even read and write, right? So by definition, almost any text written in, like, say, 18th century was aimed at this minority of people who could read, you know. So, for example, if we look at the world in general, like in the year 1800, there was only 12% of people who were literate, who could read and write. So this is kind of insanely small percentage, you know, compared to nowadays. And in the year 1900, there was only 21%, not much bigger, you know. Whereas today we have like 86, 87 maybe % of literate people all over the world. So you can see that this ratio of literate versus illiterate, unliterate, I don't know, it kind of flipped in the last 200 years. So this is definitely one of the sources of that, you know, discrepancy, like why the literature of the olden days is different from the modern literature, let's say. But I believe that the more interesting is the other reason for that I kind of found in my thoughts, and this is the phenomenon that I would call the involution. And what I mean by that is, you know, like the reverse of evolution, where evolution is like the kind of the, like in literate in literal sense from Latin, it's like the unfolding, you know, unpacking of something that was kind of hidden, you know, you kind of unfold it, right? But involution is the reverse of that. It's kind of folding in, right? Kind of hiding and archiving, well, I don't know, whatever. So I would call this phenomenon, again, in my dilettantism, the involution of semantic structures. So this is the process that occurs in languages, I believe, kind of almost like by default. Just because time goes on, just because generations, new generations appear, older generations disappear. This is accompanied by this process of what I call involution. And again, this is what I referred to previously as condensation, you know, compression of these semantic structures. So in less and less of a volume of the medium of communication, you have more and more information. This is basically, in a nutshell, this process. So, and like, we can look at some of the examples, even in science, believe it or not. Like, symbolic language of mathematics and physics would be a good example. Like, I was really amused when I read Descartes and his, you know, discourse on the method, Discours de la méthode, where he, like, literally spends a couple of paragraphs, like maybe 2 or 3, to describe a very simple equation, like of the type of a plus b equals, I don't know, 12, or something to that effect. Or there was some, you know, simple geometric relation, like a triangle and whatever. So he literally spent pages of text to express what the hell is going on in words. Whereas, you know, any like high school student today might describe all of that in one line of text, you know, a few symbols, like this plus this equals this, and etc. It's just that even the symbols that we use today weren't really in use back then, like in the middle of the 17th century. And it doesn't sound like a very long time ago, you know. But anyway, you can see this involution, again, this kind of folding in of all these concepts that you could have spent several pages of text to express verbally into only, you know, a handful of symbols, of mathematical symbols that we use today, essentially. Or you might think about the vector and tensor calculus, whereas again, a good example would be Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, where Maxwell himself derived 20 equations, right, in XYZ coordinates, but Oliver Heaviside simplified those, kind of folded them, involuted them into only 4 equations in vector calculus terms. But in modern formulation, and like in tensor form, you can just write 1 equation, like literally 5 symbols. If we're talking about the homogeneous electromagnetic wave, there would be just D'Alembert operator A mu equals 0. That's it, 5 symbols. And that's all these 20 equations of Maxwell right there. But anyway, and the same thing occurs in philosophy and social sciences, for example, where people strive to derive more and more general concepts, you know, they strive for these generalizations. The whole idea of, you know, these paradigms, this modernity that I keep talking about, the postmodernity, it's one of the forms of these generalizations, and a pretty powerful one, I should say. So yeah, some other examples might be with real languages, like spoken languages, like for example, Russian language. That I'm pretty well versed in. So, for example, absolutely the greatest Russian poet, Alexander Pushkin, he have complained in the year 1825 or about so, that you cannot really express anything smart in Russian language. I mean, in the way it was back then, right? So the Russian was absolutely underdeveloped. It was the language of the, you know, peasants, essentially. And it wasn't even the language, you know, there was no literature in Russian, basically, at the beginning of the 19th century. Like, most of the elites of the Russian Empire, they were speaking French, as was Pushkin himself. So no decent kind of scientific or whatever, no decent, like, elevated communication was possible with Russian. And like, the most famous poem of Pushkin is Evgeny Onegin, where basically, like, 2/3 of this poem, like, it has a pretty strong plot, you know, pretty cool dramatic progression, but, like, still almost like 2/3 of it or even more is just, you know, mumbling, like muttering. He just describes some scenes in Russian, like some random scenes from, you know, urban, rural life or whatever. And it definitely seems like he just wanted to, you know, explore the language. He just wanted to create the means for other people to let's say, conquer the world in Russian, so to speak, or explore the world if you feel more peaceful, so to speak, pacifistic, maybe. But anyway, so Pushkin has definitely devoted a lot of his effort for developing of the Russian language. And so did, for example, Nikolai Karamzin, who was a famous historian, again, of a contemporary thinker of Pushkin. And he also spoke French, mostly. But he, the funny thing about him is that he literally took, like, French words, and he tried to, you know, substitute parts of these words with Russian analogs. Or if there were no Russian analogs, he just, you know, substituted the letters with the same, so that, you know, they would produce the same sounds. And that, like, created, like, a whole bunch of words that the Russians think that they're owning or something. So, yeah. So, and here, you know, this SpongeBob kind of set that says, like, half a century later. And so we see, after the works of Pushkin and Karamzin and other Russian thinkers, there have emerged this huge corpus of texts, text corpus, that have allowed the others to kind of, again, fold in, kind of involve, involute, I guess, these concepts that were already developed, the language that was already developed by that time. And here you go, you have this brilliant Russian literature, people, you know, like Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Chekhov, a little bit after that, etc., etc. So you can clearly see the very same process. Like, there are, you know, these first explorers that kind of try to push the line of frontier somewhere, and there's this second wave who kind of settle in those areas that have already been explored by these pioneers, essentially. So yeah, it bears a lot of similarities to the exploration in general, and colonization even, I guess. But anyway, so this involution have allowed more and more complex concepts, I guess, more and more complex thoughts to be expressed with Russian language. And I believe that, again, this is the process that is characteristic of any sort of development of any language. Again, see the previous example with mathematics and physics. The kind of, like, the interesting features of this process, they're really peculiar. Basically what you have is that each next author doesn't have to, you know, again, go through all this frontier. It's already explored, you know. He might, like, readily use that in his texts, or, you know, whatever else the form of communication is he using. So the frontier is already pushed forward, and sometimes, you know, it's enough to just give a simple reference to the previous works. Sometimes it's enough to just give some recognizable metaphor, I guess, or short catchphrase, or even the single word that again was kind of condensed into something meaningful by previous authors, or something. Sometimes you can even skip that whole stage. You can just kind of imply, you know, between the lines, this message. And if the reader is from your culture, they're already exposed to all these culture codes, you know, they're already irradiated by this light or emission of those concepts, you know. They've already read newspapers, which also kind of imply all that. They already spoken to other people, some of whom might have read those previous works, etc. So the culture is really very nonlinear, you know. And it's very immersive in certain sense. So you don't even have to read what these guys wrote, because the other guys have already kind of sucked it in and kind of condensed this message into their own texts. So you kind of have this in your storage, in your mental palace again, by default, just by living through this culture. And it's pretty awesome, I think. It's a really fantastic phenomenon. So, kind of to conclude this long rant, I would say that from this involution, this is the second reason of this, you know, bulkiness of the authors of old. You know, basically, one might say that they haven't read yet their own creations, their own works, whereas we or our contemporaries have already did that, you know. So they have to spend all these paragraphs of text to describe whatever the thought that we can express with just a single word or a short sentence or a catchphrase or a metaphor, but they don't know that yet. I mean, they didn't know that yet back then. That's the point I'm making. So let's examine from this perspective this culture of, you know, emojis and pictures, funny pictures, the memes, the gifs, the videos that we have in our internet today. I would claim that they contain not less of the information than, you know, these lengthy texts of old again. See the phenomenon of involution previously. It's just that the form of expression, of the form of communication is different today. Again, it's more graphical, it's more animated, etc. And you can perhaps draw an analogy with paintings. You know, when like a modern thinker looks at a painting from, I don't know, 1600s or 1500s, they might like write a whole tome about it, right? Because it's so dense with information, like each small detail kind of brings like a whole avalanche of associations which are kind of entangled with each other, and they also, like, each one of them in their turn kind of draws in from many other areas of culture, etc., etc. So again, there you go, there's this involution and kind of archiving, a kind of folding in of the information, right? But there is also another aspect, and this is kind of the second phenomenon that I wish to mention in this video. And this is what I would call, again, I don't know, maybe there's some term for that in linguistics, I have no idea. But I would call that naturalization, whereby naturalization I would mean the kind of the return to more natural forms, essentially. In a way, speaking in pictures and animations is much more natural for a human being than speaking in sound or letter, you know, where letter is essentially only a symbol of sound, right? What we have in our languages today. And I believe that this kind of internal power of pictures and animations, it comes from gestures, essentially. So I would say that the simplest and the most like primitive, not putting anything bad into that word, but the most primitive in the sense that most basic form of communication is gesticulation. And I'm including, you know, facial expressions, the mimic, also here. And you might notice that, for example, most of these, you know, funny pictures, the memes, are kind of almost like a photographed gestures, you know, almost like sculptures of gestures, right? Like, for example, these, you know, think of those, you know, rage comics. They have their faces are so grotesque, you know, they're so kind of fleshed out, that I think it's really clear that it's just like a absolutized, like the most refined form of gesture you can think of, essentially. Yeah. So, but they also have this, you know, comical mood about them, and maybe I should talk about that also. So most of the time they're placed into this kind of sort of inappropriate setting. You know, you have this comics where you have some sort of tough situation, whatever, some complicated set of circumstances, some complicated environment, and at the end you have this stupid face with some you know, super grotesque gesture, etc. So this is in essence, this is what humor is all about. Like, for example, like, you know, this absurdity that is placed on top of some complicated situation. So, for example, as Nietzsche says, basically there are two phases to any joke, to any humor, and these are, first of all, you have to build the fear up. So there's this build-up of fear where you know, you kind of introduce this complicated situation. This is what, you know, the comics call the setup, right, of a joke. So you have to kind of incite fear, this complicated situation, this awkwardness or whatever. So that, and physiologically, what that makes to you, it almost literally, and I think you can measure it, in fact, it kind of, you know, makes you breathe slower, like hold your breath a little bit, like kind of hunch a little bit, like focus. So that's the setup stage, you know, when this fear is kind of building up. But the second stage is release, you know. You have some sort of absurdity following that, or some sort of, you know, trick, like in a pun, you know, like you've had some blah blah blah, but it turned out that the very word that was crucial for blah 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 is not the word that you think it was, you know, it means something else. So the whole situation is kind of, you know, inverted, like upside down or something to that effect. So this second stage is kind of transgressing this initial fear by some absurdity, by some clever trick or whatever. And it provokes, again, physiologically, when you've already hunched and you're very focused and you hold your breath. But this second stage that releases all that tension, it kind of makes you laugh. You kind of burst away, you know, you're kind of exhaling, you know, in these pulses of laughter, like, you know, like one good analogy would probably be, you know, like a spring. You kind of push the spring and it kind of all tense and compressed, and this is the build-up stage. But then you suddenly release it with, again, some absurdity or whatever, and it kind of bow, wow, 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 does that thing. So this is these bursts of laughter, you know, this kind of oscillating exhalation, relaxation, essentially, right? So yeah, this is what humor is all about, and this is the punchline, obviously, the second stage, and that also goes to show, like, why. It also shows why women, for example, prefer men with a sense of humor, right? Because any joke is this miniature of like getting stressed out and afraid, and in the end getting relaxed and kind of just happy, right? So this is essentially an emulation of the process of problem solving. And women need men who are able to solve problems, because women need men to provide the resources for them, to protect them, like whatever hardship the women would end up in, the men should save them, etc. So if you're wondering why, I recommend you to watch my video on gender, understanding gender, but I think it's fairly obvious even without watching this video, so you might say forget about it. Okay, so so this mimetic gesture, you know, this insertion of this some stupid face with this grotesque expression into your narrative, it's a perfect tool for provoking this absurd for invoking the absurdity and transgressing the complexities that were introduced previously, right, in the first stage. Yeah, and there's also a moment of familiarity. You know, when you see a familiar meme, a familiar Rage Comics character, you feel joy just because you recognize it, right? It's already safe because you've already seen it. So it kind of adds to this effect of relaxation, right? So you see something familiar and you kind of feel, oh, finally, and then I can laugh, you know, I can relax and whatever. So there's definitely also this effect. Like imagine if you're in some faraway country with no money, like somehow, and you don't know anyone, you don't know the language, and you're just stranded on the streets and you're super stressed out and afraid, but you suddenly encounter a familiar face, like you're a friend of yours or something. You would definitely be very relaxed and very joyful, like finally somebody can help me, etc. So this is exactly the same effect right here, but only in, you know, very miniaturized version. So I would say that in general, the gesture, we might call a gesture like almost a direct personification of motion, like motion in general. And like it's actually the most simple, the motion is the most simple and the most general form of signals that we might recognize, you know, again, in the most arbitrary and general sense. Like you can't even see if you don't have any motion. Like if you just stare at the same spot and don't blink and don't move your eyes, like very quickly the picture would get saturated and you wouldn't see anything. Well, maybe not very quickly, but maybe in a couple of minutes, let's say. So you need motion to kind of even see things, etc. But okay, that's a bit of a digression. But anyway, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, he actually thought that the most general form of motion is music. So he thought that the music is like the ultimate emanation, like the most basic emanation of what he called the world's will, you know, in his theory, etc. And you can later transform music into some secondary forms of motion, like poetry, architecture, drama or painting or whatever. So they are all kind of secondary special cases of this most general form of motion, which is music, according to him. But I'm more in line with Nietzsche's thoughts. Nietzsche was actually saying explicitly that no, it's actually the gesture which is the most primitive form, the most basic form of motion, and it's the most recognized form of motion, in the sense that it kind of it's only one step away from the basic physiology, you know. Again, I've given this example with humor, but just think of, like, okay, let me give you a couple of examples. Like, I can push you away, just like literally pushing you away, and you would feel that physiologically, so you would have to respond somehow, etc. But I might make the same gesture, I might just do a gesture like that, And you would immediately recognize that, because it's, again, it's almost like almost physiological, not quite there, but almost, right? So you would recognize this gesture. You would kind of understand that, I mean, stop, like you're not going here, you know, I'm gonna push you if you proceed further, etc. So it's easily understandable. Or if I do a gesture like that, like for example, so physiologically I might just come up to you and kind of push you away like that, you know. But in the form of gesture, I just do that, and you understand that, no, like, we don't need that, like, put that away, etc. And it's really easy, like, it's almost on that physiological level, etc., etc. So I hope this is pretty clear. I've once actually written an aphorism that kind of signifies this role of gestures. Like, I wrote something to it was in Russian, so this is going to be a translation. So I wrote something like, the prose is only a shadow of gesticulation, the poetry is its clothes, and music is its spirit. All right? And it obviously ties to the idea of how dance appeared, for example. Like, the dance is really only a gesticulation kind of animated by music, right? So music kind of gives you a sanction to just freely gesticulate. But the music itself it's not yet a gesticulation. It's only a special case of it at the very best. That's the point. And from dance we have the theater, etc., etc. So, but I'm not going to be talking about that. And again, kind of attacking this Schopenhauer's point, we might say that, well, the language of music itself is already kind of secondary. It's very symbolic, you know, you have to have some alphabet in some sense. Like in music, we have these tensions between sounds in terms of pitch. We have tensions in terms of, you know, tempo and meter, etc. We have tensions in the sense of timbre, you know, what kind of instrument you're using, etc., etc. So, and I'm not even talking about, you know, the particular musical systems, which we have like hundreds of them, like, or perhaps even thousands of them all over the world, which are very different, and they have these, you know, additional layers of symbolism on top of that, the most basic one, etc. So it's very secondary, it's very symbolic. And I'm not even talking about, you know, the super complicated European harmony, which, like, you have to spend a few years learning it to understand what some particular form of, you know, melody versus harmony means, etc., etc. So I guess we might slowly creep into the conclusions. So I would say that the pictures and animations that we're kind of diving into the realm of today are actually more natural way of communication than the spoken or written word, right? It's much more natural, again, exactly because it's closer to the most basic form of communication, which is gesture. Okay. And thus, like, the more we move closer to that gesture realm, the more we're involved in his music, you know, again, kind of paraphrasing Schopenhauer, and hence the title of this video, by the way, and beyond, actually, beyond the realm of music into the realm of gestures, as I've elucidated above. And I would say that, just to add to that rant about gestures above, I would add that the gesture, in my opinion, and physicality in general, you know, your bodiness, so to speak, is the expression of intent in some sense, you know, poetically speaking, or the will to power, if you like, in Nietzschean terms. There was a brilliant French visionary, Gabriel Deschamps, who said that literally a body is the expression of intent, right? So body has organs, but the organs are only there to serve some purpose, And purpose is only there when you have the intent, the will, right? The will shapes the organs in some sense, some sort of internal, will to power, essentially. But anyway, and so gesture is almost like a direct, almost like mechanical interaction between people. It's, again, as I've said, it's almost like only one step away from like literal physicality, literal physiology. So it can be easily understood, and it's, again, the most basic form of communication, and all the other forms of communication are only like children of gesture, essentially. So again, to conclude once again, I would say that the naturalization, the return to most natural forms of communication, is definitely a tendency today. And we have memes because of that. Because, and maybe this is one of the steps towards the direct kinesthetic communication, where kinesthetic, it means like connected to motion or associated with motion. So gestures are definitely kinesthetic, as I've shown to you in those examples, that they directly invoke some motion, some feeling of motion. Some passion, which is also a form of motion, some intent, which is also a form of motion, etc. So they're the most basic patterns of our perception, let's say, or at least communication. And this fast multimedia communication that we have today definitely allowed us to make that step, into graphical, animated video, gif, whatever character of communication. Like, it wasn't possible 200 years ago, where you couldn't even listen to music. You didn't have a radio, you didn't even have any record player. Basically, you only had books, right? You only had texts. But today, when we have all these means, all these technical means and memes, right? All these technical possibilities, we can return to the most natural way of communication. And I think it's a good thing, fundamentally. And the other process that I've called involution makes sure that the communication would be still very condensed. It would still bear, even if it's a small picture, a picture of Lenin kind of with his fist. And this small picture, it already contains all these narratives, all this collectivization, industrialization, communist death camps, World War II. All that is contained in this small picture, right? And we recognize that, and it's a good thing, I think. Like, it's really efficient. It's fundamentally well suited for our nature. I think so, at least. So we have memes from naturalization due to the new technical possibilities, and involution, which is characteristic of any type of language. And I believe, at least I hope, I was able to show you all that. So hope you had fun. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.